December 14th, 1961. 31 American soldiers walked into the Amazon rainforest on what their commanding officer called a routine reconnaissance mission. 7 days later, only 2 walked out. The military says it never happened. There are no records, no declassified documents, no memorial. But I found one of them. What he told me, I haven't slept properly since. Before we begin, understand this. I can't verify everything you're about to hear. The man I spoke to was in his early 80s, suffering from advanced dementia. But the details he gave me, the dates, the locations, the names, some of them check out in ways that make me deeply uncomfortable. If you're watching this late at night, you might want to save it for morning. This is what he told me. His name was Michael Graves. At least, that's what his nursing home records said. When I first met him in that sterile room in Tucson, Arizona, he didn't want to talk. Just stared out the window at the desert like he was looking for something that wasn't there. But when I mentioned the year 1961, his hand started shaking. When I said the word Manaus, he grabbed my wrist so hard I thought he'd break it. And when I showed him the photograph, the one I found in a box of declassified CIA documents labeled expedited disposal, he started crying. The photograph showed 31 men in olive drab uniforms standing in front of a C-47 cargo plane. Someone had tried to burn it. The edges were charred, and most of the faces were obscured by fire damage. But in the back row, third from the left, was a young man who looked exactly like Michael Graves. He told me everything over the course of 4 hours. I recorded it all. What follows is his testimony, edited for clarity but otherwise unchanged. This is his story. In November 1961, Graves was a 22-year-old Army specialist assigned to Fort Bragg, North Carolina. He'd enlisted 2 years earlier, trained as a radio operator, and spent most of his service monitoring Soviet communications in a windowless building that smelled like cigarette smoke and burnt coffee. He'd never left the continental United States. He'd never fired his weapon outside of a training range. And he'd certainly never expected to be woken at 0300 hours by 2 men in civilian clothes who told him to pack a bag and ask no questions. By 0600, he was on a plane with 30 other soldiers he'd never met. No unit insignia. No mission briefing. Just a captain named Rourke, who chain-smoked Lucky Strikes and told them they were going somewhere hot. They landed in Manaus, Brazil, 14 hours later. Graves remembered the heat hitting him like a physical wall when the cargo door opened. Humid, thick, suffocating heat that made it hard to breathe. The air tasted like vegetation and diesel fuel. A Brazilian Army liaison met them on the tarmac. A colonel named Da Silva, who spoke perfect English and didn't smile once during the entire conversation. He loaded them into covered trucks and drove them 3 hours west into the rainforest, along roads that got progressively worse until they weren't roads anymore. Just mud tracks cut through green walls of jungle. They stopped at what Graves called a staging area, a clearing with 4 prefab buildings, a radio mast, and a perimeter of sandbags. No identification markers, no flags. Just 31 American soldiers and 12 Brazilian personnel who watched them like they were contagious. Captain Rourke finally gave them the briefing that night. 6 days earlier, a Brazilian geological survey team had gone missing approximately 40 kilometers west of their position. The team had been mapping potential mineral deposits, standard corporate-funded work. They'd been in radio contact every 12 hours like clockwork. Then they'd stopped. The Brazilian government sent a search party. That party also went silent. A second search party was dispatched with better equipment and military escort. They found the first search party. What they found, and this is where Rourke's voice got quiet, suggested the men hadn't died from natural causes. They'd been killed by something or someone, but the bodies had been arranged in patterns. Geometric patterns that the Brazilian military couldn't explain and didn't want to investigate further. That's when they called the Americans. The official story was joint military training exercise. The real mission, Find the original geological team, determine what happened to the search parties, and secure the area. Graves asked the obvious question. Secure it from what? Rourke crushed out his cigarette and looked at him for a long moment. That's what we're going to find out. They had no idea they were walking into something that would haunt the two survivors for the rest of their lives. They moved out at dawn. 31 American soldiers, 8 Brazilian Army personnel, and 2 guides, local men from a village somewhere downriver who Da Silva had hired. The guides refused to carry weapons. They also refused to explain why. Graves was part of the communications team with 3 other specialists. Their job was to maintain radio contact with the staging area every 4 hours and relay any findings back to command. The jungle was... Graves struggled to describe it to me. He kept using the word alive, not in the poetic sense. He meant it literally. The jungle felt aware, watching. Every sound seemed deliberate. Every shadow seemed to move independently of the wind. The heat was unbearable. Within an hour, everyone's uniforms were soaked through. The humidity made it impossible for sweat to evaporate, so it just accumulated, creating a breeding ground for insects that seemed to swarm specifically around exposed skin. But worse than the heat or the insects was the silence. Graves had expected the jungle to be loud, monkeys howling, birds calling, insects buzzing. Instead, it was oppressively quiet. Just the sound of 39 men moving through undergrowth and their own labored breathing. One of the Brazilian guides noticed it too. He stopped frequently, listening, his face growing more concerned with each kilometer they traveled. On the second day, they found the first search party's camp. The tents were still standing. Equipment was organized and functional. Food supplies were intact, but there were no people. And there was blood. Not a lot. Just spatters on the tent fabric, drops in the soil. But the pattern was wrong. It didn't look like combat. It didn't look like an animal attack. It looked like someone had been taken mid-action and simply bled as they were dragged away. Captain Rourke ordered a defensive perimeter. They spent 4 hours searching the area, finding nothing else. No bodies, no tracks, no indication of where 15 men had gone. But they found something else. Carved into trees surrounding the camp were symbols. Deep cuts in the bark, some old enough to have scarred over, some recent enough that sap was still bleeding from the wounds. The symbols weren't Portuguese, weren't Spanish, weren't any indigenous language the guides recognized. One of the guides, an older man named Tavares, looked at the carvings for maybe 10 seconds before dropping his pack and walking away from the camp. Da Silva tried to stop him, demanding he return. Tavares just kept walking, back the way they'd come, not running but moving with absolute determination. They let him go. That left 38. They should have followed him. They should have turned around right then, but soldiers follow orders, and their orders were to push forward. They reached the original geological survey team's last known position on the afternoon of day 3. The camp wasn't just abandoned. It was pristine. Equipment was still running. A generator hummed quietly, powering lights that had been burning for over a week. A coffee pot sat on a camp stove, the liquid inside reduced to black sludge. But arranged in the center of the camp, placed with obvious care, were 6 backpacks. Each one opened, contents spread out in neat rows, wallets, photographs, letters from home, personal effects that nobody would abandon voluntarily. And in the center of that arrangement, 6 wedding rings on a flat stone. One of the Brazilian soldiers started praying. Another threw up. Captain Rourke's face went gray, but his voice stayed level. Perimeter. Now, nobody touches anything until we document everything. Graves was setting up the radio equipment when he heard it. A sound. He described it to me as something between a hum and a vibration. Not loud enough to hurt, but present enough that once you noticed it, you couldn't unnotice it. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, through the ground, through the air, through his own chest cavity. "Do you hear that?" he asked the specialist next to him, a kid from Ohio named Palmer. Palmer's face was pale. "Yeah, what is that?" The hum grew gradually louder over the next 10 minutes. Other soldiers started noticing it. Some covered their ears, but that didn't help. It wasn't coming through their ears. It was coming through their bones. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. Captain Rourke made the call. They'd secure the camp for the night, document everything at first light, then fall back to the staging area and call for additional support. Whatever they were dealing with was beyond their capability to handle. It was the right decision, but it was already too late, because something had been watching them since they entered the jungle, and now it knew exactly where they were. They set up defensive positions in a circle around the camp. 4-man fire teams, 2 hours on watch, rotating throughout the night. Graves was assigned to the 2,200 to midnight shift with Palmer, a sergeant named Mackenzie, and one of the Brazilian corporals. The jungle remained silent. No insects, no animals, nothing. Just that oppressive stillness, broken only by the sound of men breathing and the occasional clink of equipment being adjusted. At 22:47 hours, Palmer tapped Graves on the shoulder and pointed into the darkness beyond their perimeter. Something was standing between 2 trees about 30 meters out. Graves couldn't make out details. Just a silhouette, human-sized, motionless. He raised his rifle, flipped on the mounted flashlight, and illuminated. Nothing. The space between the trees was empty. "I saw it," Palmer whispered. "I swear to God, something was standing right there." Sergeant Mackenzie told them to stay alert and report anything else they saw. 15 minutes later, Graves saw it too. A figure. Same distance, different position. Standing perfectly still among the trees, just visible enough to register as present, but too shadowy to identify. He swept his light across the tree line. Nothing. Then he saw them. Not one figure. Dozens of them. Surrounding the entire camp in a loose circle, each one standing motionless about 20 to 30 meters into the jungle. All facing inward. All watching. "Contact," Mackenzie hissed into his radio. "Multiple unknowns surrounding our position." The entire camp snapped to alert. Flashlights and weapon-mounted lights swept the perimeter. The figures didn't move, didn't react, just stood there, barely visible in the darkness. Captain Rourke's voice came over the radio, forced calm. "Can anyone get positive identification?" Graves trained his light on the nearest figure. The beam illuminated something that made his stomach drop. It looked human, stood like a human, had the rough shape of a human. But the proportions were wrong. The arms hung too long. The head sat at a slight angle that no living person could maintain. And the skin, what he could see of it, had a waxy, translucent quality that reflected light in a way that flesh shouldn't. "Sir," Graves heard himself say, "I don't think those are people." Before Rourke could respond, one of the Brazilian soldiers opened fire. The muzzle flash illuminated the jungle in strobing bursts of light. In those brief flashes, Graves saw the figures clearly for the first time. They wore clothes, shredded, rotted clothes that hung from frames that had been human once but weren't anymore. Their faces were slack, mouths hanging open, eyes clouded white. But they moved. Not walking, jerking forward in stuttering motions like broken marionettes, closing the distance impossibly fast. The entire perimeter erupted in gunfire. Graves fired at the nearest figure, hit its center mass, saw the impact, saw it stagger, saw it keep coming. He fired again. Headshot. The figure's head snapped back, and it dropped. But 3 more were already past its position, moving toward the perimeter with that horrible jerking gait. Men were screaming. Orders were being shouted. Radio discipline collapsed into panic as everyone tried to report contact simultaneously. Graves emptied his magazine into the approaching figures. Some dropped, some didn't. The ones that fell didn't stay down. They twitched, spasmed, and began dragging themselves forward using whatever limbs still functioned. "Fall back," Rourke was bellowing. "Controlled retreat to the center." They collapsed the perimeter inward, 38 men forming a tight circle, firing outward at targets that were now pouring from the tree line. Not dozens anymore. Hundreds, all wearing the rotted remnants of clothing, all moving with that same broken puppet motion, all coming from every direction at once. Graves saw one wearing the shredded uniform of the Brazilian search party. Saw another wearing civilian clothes that matched the description of the geological survey team. They weren't just attacking. They were reclaiming their own. A Brazilian private beside Graves went down, pulled from the circle by hands that emerged from the mass of bodies. His scream cut off abruptly, replaced by wet tearing sounds. That was 37. "The camp!" someone yelled. "Fall back to the buildings!" They ran. Graves didn't remember the details, just sprinting through darkness, things grabbing at him from all sides, gunfire so continuous it became a single rolling thunder, and men falling, always falling. They reached the prefab structures the geological team had erected. 4 buildings, metal-sided, with doors that could be barricaded. 22 men made it inside. 16 hadn't. And as they barricaded the doors, as they listened to the sounds of hundreds of those things surrounding the buildings, Graves realized something that made him want to scream. The hum was back, and this time, it was forming words. They held those buildings for 3 hours. 3 hours of those things hammering on the walls, clawing at the doors, pressing against the structures with enough combined force that the metal sides began to buckle inward. 3 hours of that hum vibrating through everything, resolving into syllables that almost sounded like language but hurt to process consciously. And 3 hours of men breaking. The first was a specialist named Torres. He dropped his weapon, walked to the door, and started removing the barricade. It took 4 men to pull him away. He fought like an animal, screaming that they were calling him, that he needed to go to them, that they promised it wouldn't hurt. They tied him to a support beam, but he kept talking to something none of them could see, carrying on a conversation with invisible participants in a language that wasn't English or Portuguese or anything Graves recognized. Then Corporal Mackenzie started bleeding from his ears. No injury, no trauma, just blood, streaming down the sides of his face while he stared at nothing and whispered coordinates. Longitude and latitude, repeated over and over, always the same numbers. Da Silva plotted them on his map. The coordinates pointed to a location 40 kilometers south, deep jungle, unmapped. "That's where they want us to go," Da Silva said quietly. Captain Rourke was holding it together, but barely. His hands shook as he tried to raise the staging area on the radio. Nothing but static. The hum was interfering with transmission, or something was actively jamming them, or... The radio crackled. Not static. Voices, multiple voices, speaking in unison through the radio, using the same, not quite language that Torres was speaking. Palmer ripped the radio apart with his bare hands. That's when the lights went out. Emergency flashlights clicked on, casting harsh shadows. In that brief moment of darkness, something had changed. Graves could feel it, a shift in pressure, like descending rapidly in an aircraft. Captain Rourke made the decision. "We can't hold this position. We move at first light. We break through their perimeter and head east back to staging. Anyone who can't move gets left behind." Nobody argued. They all understood the math. Torres had stopped speaking. His head lolled forward, and for a moment Graves thought he'd passed out. Then his head lifted. His eyes were clouded white, just like the things outside. And when he spoke, it was with dozens of voices layered over each other. "You should have stayed away." Rourke shot him without hesitation. Single round, center forehead. Torres's body slumped. 19 men watched in silence. "Anyone else feeling called to?" Rourke said flatly. "Speak up now so I can save ammunition." Nobody spoke. At 0500, with the sky just beginning to lighten, they prepared to move. They had no idea that most of them would never see that staging area again. They went out firing. All 4 doors simultaneously. Coordinated burst, hoping to create enough chaos to punch through the perimeter. It almost worked. The things had pulled back slightly with the dawn, forming a loose cordon about 50 meters from the buildings. The initial volley caught them off guard, if they could be caught off guard. Several dropped. The rest reacted slowly. 19 men ran. Graves was in the middle of the formation, keeping pace with Palmer and Mackenzie. De Silva was on point with Captain Rourke. The plan was simple. Break east, keep moving, maintain formation, stop for nothing. They made it maybe 300 meters before the jungle erupted. Not just the reanimated corpses this time. Something else was moving through the canopy overhead. Something big. Graves caught glimpses. Elongated bodies, too many limbs, moving through the branches with a speed that shouldn't be possible for anything that size. A Brazilian lieutenant named Costa looked up at the wrong moment. Something dropped onto him from above. Graves saw it for maybe 2 seconds. A mass of pale flesh and too many joints, wrapping around Costa like a spider cocooning prey. Costa screamed once. Then he was gone, pulled upward into the canopy so fast it seemed physically impossible. 18. They kept running. More of those things were dropping from above now. One landed between Graves and the man in front of him. He got a clear look this time. Roughly man-sized but built wrong. Limbs bending in ways that violated basic anatomy. Covered in skin that looked slick and translucent. The face was worst. Almost human. Close enough to be recognizable, but distorted, stretched. The features arranged slightly wrong, like a painting by someone who'd only heard humans described, but never seen one. It reached for him with hands that had too many fingers. Palmer shot it. The thing recoiled, leaking something that wasn't quite blood. Too thick, too pale. They kept running, leaving it convulsing on the jungle floor. "Keep moving!" Rourke was screaming. "Don't stop!" A sergeant named Paulson went down, his leg caught in something. Roots that hadn't been there a moment before, now wrapped around his calf with enough force to snap bone. He was screaming for help, reaching toward the formation. Nobody stopped. 17. The jungle was fighting them now. Vines seemed to move deliberately, reaching for ankles. The undergrowth grew denser despite them following the same path they'd used to enter. Tree branches hung lower, forcing them to duck and weave. And that hum never stopped. Always present, always forming words just on the edge of comprehension. They ran for hours. Men fell, sometimes to exhaustion, sometimes pulled down by things Graves couldn't see clearly. Sometimes they just stopped, turned around, and walked back toward the pursuing mass with expressions of peaceful acceptance. Captain Rourke shot 2 of his own men who tried to turn back. By noon, they were down to 7. By 1400 hours, they were down to 4. Captain Rourke, Corporal Mackenzie, Specialist Palmer, and Specialist Graves. They stopped only because they physically couldn't continue. Collapsed in a small clearing, gasping for air. Legs shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline crash. Mackenzie was bleeding from his nose now, not just his ears. The blood was darker than it should be. Rourke checked his map with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. "We're close. Maybe 5 kilometers from staging, if we can maintain pace." Palmer vomited. Not normal vomit. Black liquid that smelled like copper and rot. Mackenzie stood up slowly. His eyes were losing focus. "Corporal," Rourke said quietly, raising his weapon. "I need you to stay with me." Mackenzie smiled. It was the worst thing Graves had ever seen. "They're not enemies, Captain. They're trying to help us understand. They've been here so long, waiting. They just want—" Rourke fired. 3 men remained. They moved in silence, weapons ready, eyes scanning constantly. The jungle had gone quiet again. No pursuit, no sounds, just stillness. They should have been relieved. Instead, it felt like anticipation. They reached the staging area at 16:47 hours. The perimeter fence was intact. The buildings were standing. The radio mast was functional, and there wasn't a single person there. 12 Brazilian personnel, plus whatever support staff had remained behind. Gone. Vehicles were present, equipment was running. But no people. And on the door of the main building, carved deep into the metal, the same symbols they'd seen in the jungle. Fresh. The metal was still curled from the cuts. "This isn't right," Palmer whispered. "This was done recently. They were here. They were watching us this whole time." Captain Rourke moved to the radio equipment. His hands were steadier now. Steadier in the way hands get when someone has accepted something terrible. He broadcast on emergency frequencies, requesting immediate extraction, providing coordinates, declaring a critical situation. Static answered him. He tried different frequencies, different protocols, always static. Until a voice came through, speaking Portuguese. A woman's voice, calm and professional, announcing the date and time and a weather report for Manaus. A normal radio broadcast from the city. Rourke almost collapsed with relief. "Thank God, it's working. We can—" The broadcast cut off mid-word, and that hum came through the speakers, followed by dozens of voices speaking in unison. "You were told to stay away." Rourke destroyed the radio, smashed it with the butt of his rifle until it was sparking fragments. "We walk," he said. 300 kilometers to Manaus if we follow the river. We can make it." Nobody believed him. But what else could they do? They survived the jungle. They evaded the pursuit. But they were about to discover something worse than any of the horror they'd experienced. They were about to discover they'd been allowed to escape. They followed the river for 2 days. Didn't sleep, couldn't sleep, just walked through day and night, taking turns supporting each other when exhaustion made coordination difficult. The jungle seemed normal again. Birds called, insects buzzed, monkeys howled in the canopy. The oppressive stillness was gone, replaced by the chaotic noise of a living ecosystem. It should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like mockery. Palmer was deteriorating. Not physically, he could still walk, still function, but he talked to himself constantly in that same not-quite language Mackenzie had used. And sometimes he'd stop mid-stride, tilt his head like listening to something, then continue walking without explanation. Graves watched him carefully. So did Rourke. On the morning of the 3rd day, they saw smoke. A village. Actual civilization. Graves wanted to cry with relief. They approached slowly, weapons lowered but ready. Rourke called out in Portuguese, announcing they were American military, requesting assistance. The village was occupied. 20, maybe 30 people. Families, children. Normal people living normal lives in the middle of the Amazon rainforest. They stared at the 3 soldiers like they were ghosts. An older man approached, spoke rapid Portuguese to Rourke. His face went from concerned to horrified as Rourke explained their situation. The old man backed away, shaking his head, making a warding gesture. "What?" Graves asked. "What did you tell him?" Rourke's face was gray. "I told him where we came from, the area we were operating in. And he says that area is forbidden. Has been for generations. The old ones live there. Anyone who goes in doesn't come back, or if they do." "If they do what?" The old man was talking to the other villagers now. They were all backing away, retreating into their homes, closing doors and shutters. "If they do," Rourke continued quietly, "they come back changed. And they bring the calling with them." Palmer chose that moment to start laughing. Not normal laughter. The layered, multi-voice laughter that came from a throat that shouldn't be able to produce those sounds. "They know," Palmer said in that chorus of voices. "They've always known. This forest isn't yours. It was never yours. You're just passing through our hunting ground." Rourke shot him. Palmer fell. Blood spread from the wound. But he kept laughing, even as he bled out, even as his eyes clouded over, even as his body went still. Then, impossibly, his hand twitched. Rourke shot him twice more. The villagers had barricaded themselves inside. Graves could see faces in the windows, terrified, watching. "We need to leave," Graves said. "Now." They ran from the village. Ran from Palmer's body. ran from the accusatory stares of people who knew what they'd brought with them. They ran until Rourke collapsed. Graves tried to help him up. Rourke pushed him away. "Look at me," Rourke said. Graves looked. Rourke's eyes were clouding. Not dramatically, just slightly. Enough to notice. "It's in me," Rourke said calmly. "Has been since the first night, I think. I've been hearing them this whole time, kept quiet, stayed focused, but it's getting louder. Sir, listen to me, specialist. Whatever this is, infection, possession, I don't know. It spreads. Through proximity, through sound, I don't know. But I'm carrying it. You might be too. We can't go back to civilization. We bring this out of the jungle and it spreads." "What are you saying?" Rourke drew his sidearm. Looked at it for a long moment. "I'm saying you need to keep moving. Get to Manaus. Find someone in authority. Tell them to quarantine this entire region. Burn it if they have to. But this can't spread." "Captain, that's an order." Rourke put the barrel under his chin and fired before Graves could stop him. Michael Graves walked alone for 4 more days. He followed the river, avoided villages, drank when thirsty, ate nothing, and every night he heard them. The voices, the hum, the calling. But he didn't answer. He couldn't explain why. Just stubbornness, maybe, or fear, or the last remnant of self-preservation overriding whatever influence was trying to take hold. He reached the outskirts of Manaus on December 24th, 1961. He was found by police officers responding to reports of a delirious American stumbling through the streets, covered in mud and blood, raving about things in the jungle. They took him to a hospital. He told them everything. They didn't believe him. They contacted the American embassy. The embassy contacted military intelligence. Military intelligence sent 2 men in suits who asked him very specific questions about locations, coordinates, and what he'd seen. Then they thanked him for his service and informed him he'd be returning to the United States immediately for psychiatric evaluation and debriefing. They also informed him he'd never been to Brazil. There had been no mission. Operation Cedar Sweep, the official name he learned later, had never existed. The 30 other men had never existed. He'd suffered a psychotic break during routine training at Fort Bragg and had been hospitalized. That was the official story. That was the story that would be in his medical records, his service jacket, his discharge papers. He was given an honorable discharge, a pension for psychological disability, and a very polite but very clear understanding that if he ever spoke about this to anyone, there would be consequences. He never did. Until me. After our interview, I spent 3 months researching. I found nothing. No Operation Cedar Sweep. No deployment of American troops to Brazil in late 1961. No record of 31 soldiers dying or going missing. But I found other things. I found a Brazilian military report from January 1962 describing a quarantine operation in the Amazon. Specific coordinates, armed perimeter, orders to shoot anyone attempting to leave a certain region. The quarantine lasted 6 months. Then the orders were rescinded. No explanation given. I found a memo from the CIA, heavily redacted, discussing joint cooperation with Brazilian intelligence regarding biological containment in South American theater, 1961 to 1962. I found 3 death certificates. American soldiers, all listed as dying in training accidents at Fort Bragg between December 1961 and January 1962. All the same day listed as date of death, December 18th, 1961. All 3 buried in Arlington with full honors. No family in attendance, no service records accessible. And I found one more thing. A geological survey from 2019. Commercial operation, different company, different team, different purpose, but operating in the same general region that Michael Graves described. They went silent after 4 days. A rescue operation was launched. Found the camp, found equipment, found no people. The Brazilian government shut down all commercial operations in that region. No explanation, just closed 1,000 square kilometers to any access. It's still closed. I tried to contact Michael Graves again, to ask follow-up questions, to verify details. The nursing home informed me he'd passed away 3 days after our interview. Natural causes, peacefully, in his sleep. But a nurse I spoke to told me something strange. The night before he died, Michael woke up screaming. Said they were calling him. Said he'd resisted for 60 years but couldn't anymore. Said he was sorry. Then he'd gone quiet, smiled, closed his eyes. And when they found him in the morning, his eyes were clouded white. The nurse showed me a photo she'd taken with her phone, against protocol, but she was shaken and wanted documentation. I verified the photo wasn't edited, verified the date, verified everything. It's real. And when I look at it, when I look at Michael Graves' dead face with those clouded eyes, I can almost hear it. That hum, that calling, that promise of understanding something we were never meant to understand. I don't know what's in that jungle. I don't know if it's biological, if it's something ancient, if it's something else entirely. But I know this. 31 men walked in, 2 walked out, and 60 years later, both of them answered the call. If you're watching this and you've been to that region, if you've heard something you can't explain, if you've seen patterns that hurt to look at, if you've felt that hum in your chest, don't go back. Whatever's out there, it's patient. It's been there longer than we have. It'll be there longer than we will. And it's always listening for someone to answer. This is Deathline Stories. Some stories don't end. Some stories just wait.